For years, Amanda Martinez ran the front door of Linden and Company, one of Beverly Hills' most exclusive restaurants. Every morning, she'd straighten her black blazer, check her perfectly styled hair in the mirror, and take her place behind the mahogany podium like a queen taking her throne. The power she held was better than any fancy meal the restaurant served. She got to decide who was worthy enough to eat there and who would be turned away. She loved watching people's faces fall when she told them there were no tables available, even when the dining room sat half empty behind her. Amanda had worked her way up from being a simple waitress to the head host over 10 years. She remembered how it felt to be looked down on when she first started, carrying heavy plates and dealing with demanding customers. Now, at 35, she was the one doing the looking down. She watched rich people come and go through the restaurant's sparkling glass doors, studying how they dressed, memorizing how they talked, and noting how they carried themselves. She created her own secret rulebook about who deserved a table, rules that had nothing to do with the restaurant's actual policies. In her mind, she wasn't just protecting the restaurant's image, she was protecting her own carefully built world where she finally belonged among the elite. The restaurant itself was a masterpiece of luxury. Crystal chandeliers caught the California sunlight, making tiny rainbows dance across white tablecloths. The walls were covered in expensive artwork, and even the water glasses were cut crystal. Amanda saw herself as the guardian of all this elegance, even though she could barely afford to eat there herself on her host's salary. One quiet Wednesday afternoon, between the lunch rush and dinner service, the restaurant hummed with its usual peaceful energy. Several tables were occupied by regular customers, the kind Amanda approved of. Business executives who had loosened their designer ties after long meetings sat discussing million-dollar deals. Ladies who lunch, dressed head to toe in Chanel and Gucci, sipped their third glass of $100 wine while gossiping about their neighbors' divorces and planning their next shopping trips to Paris. Everything was exactly how Amanda liked it, predictable, controlled, and properly exclusive. The sound of the door opening made Amanda look up from her reservation book, ready to scan whoever entered with her practiced eye. A black family stepped inside, and Amanda felt her jaw tighten automatically. The father wore a Tom Ford suit that probably cost more than her car. She knew because she'd seen the same one on a regular customer last week. His shoes were handmade Italian leather, and his watch looked like it could pay her rent for a year. The mother was a vision of elegance in a flowing Hermes silk blouse and tailored pants. Her natural hair styled in a sophisticated updo that spoke of expensive salons. They had 2 children with them. A teenage boy, maybe 14, who kept adjusting his perfectly knotted tie with nervous fingers, and a young girl, around 10, clutching a Birkin bag that Amanda recognized as being nearly impossible to get unless you had serious connections. But Amanda didn't care about their designer clothes or their obvious wealth. She'd already made her decision in the first second they walked in. In her mind, they didn't fit the image she'd created for Linden and Company, even though she had no right to make that decision. Her prejudice was so deeply ingrained that she didn't even recognize it as prejudice anymore. She just called it maintaining standards. She put on her practiced fake smile, the one that never reached her eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone already dismissive. The father gave her a warm, genuine smile that made her fake one feel even more plastic. "Yes, we'd like a table for 4, please." His voice was deep and cultured, with the confidence of someone used to being respected. Amanda didn't even pretend to check her reservation book. "I'm sorry, we're fully booked," she lied, ignoring the many empty tables visible behind her. The father wasn't angry or upset, like Amanda expected. Instead, he calmly looked around at the half-empty restaurant, his eyebrows rising slightly. "That's strange," he said softly. "I see quite a few empty tables." Amanda's perfectly manicured fingers gripped her podium tighter. She wasn't used to people questioning her authority. She'd perfected the art of turning people away so smoothly that most just accepted it and left. She forced another smile, this one even less convincing than the first. "Unfortunately, those tables are all reserved for our regular customers," she lied again, even though anyone could see through it. The mother shifted her weight slightly, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes taking in everything. The teenage boy stood straighter, his hands clasped behind his back, trying to look unbothered, but the slight clench of his jaw betraying his feelings. The young girl looked up at her father with complete trust, waiting to see how he would handle the situation. The father maintained his calm demeanor, but something in his eyes changed. A flash of understanding, perhaps, or resignation to a situation he'd faced before. "In that case, I'd like to speak with the manager," he said, his voice still perfectly polite, but with an undertone of authority that Amanda missed completely. She gave him her most condescending smile, the one she reserved for people who tried to challenge her. "I'm afraid the manager isn't available right now," she said, thinking she'd won this little power play. The family turned to leave, the children maintaining the same quiet dignity as their parents. But then something happened that would shatter Amanda's carefully controlled world forever. Paul Chen, the restaurant manager, who usually trusted Amanda's judgment completely, came bursting out of his office like the building was on fire. His normally perfectly pressed shirt was wrinkled from how quickly he'd jumped up from his desk, and his face was flushed with panic. "Where are they?" he demanded, scanning the dining room frantically. When Amanda told him the family had left, his face turned from red to ghost white in seconds. Without another word, he ran for the door so fast that Amanda's precious podium shook. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Amanda watched in growing confusion as Paul chased after the family, gesturing apologetically and practically begging them to return. She felt the first real stirring of unease in her stomach. In 10 years, she'd never seen Paul behave like this with anyone, not even when actual movie stars had been turned away. The family returned, and that's when Amanda's perfectly constructed world began to crumble piece by piece. Paul led them to table 1, the best table in the house, the one usually reserved for visiting dignitaries and A-list celebrities. As they walked past her, Amanda finally noticed something she should have seen immediately. The way every employee who recognized them straightened up. The way the regular customers' eyes widened. The way the very atmosphere of the restaurant changed. Then Paul said the words that would change everything. "Please accept our sincerest apologies, Mr. and Mrs. Bennett. This is completely unacceptable." And just like that, Amanda felt the floor drop out from under her feet. This wasn't just any family she'd tried to turn away. This was the Bennett family. Leon Bennett wasn't just wealthy. He was a self-made billionaire who owned the entire Linden and Company restaurant chain, along with dozens of other luxury businesses. She had just denied service to her boss's boss's boss, the man whose name was on her paychecks. The restaurant fell into a hushed silence as Leon Bennett turned to address Amanda. His question was simple but devastating. "Why did you turn my family away?" His voice wasn't raised or angry. It was calm and measured, which somehow made it infinitely worse. Amanda opened her mouth, but no words came out. How could she explain that she judged them purely based on their race? that she'd decided in mere seconds that they couldn't belong in her restaurant, even though it was actually their restaurant? Leon's wife, Camille, spoke next, her voice as smooth as expensive silk, but sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. "Is this how you treat all your guests, Amanda?" She emphasized Amanda's name slightly, making it clear she'd read the nameplate on the podium. Paul tried desperately to salvage the situation, sweating through his shirt as he called it a misunderstanding. But Leon cut through the excuse like it was tissue paper. "She didn't think we belonged here," he said, stating the uncomfortable truth that everyone in the restaurant could now see clearly. "That's not a misunderstanding. That's a decision she made the second we walked in. A decision that reflects poorly not just on her, but on our entire organization." Their daughter whispered something to her mother, and Amanda caught a glimpse of confusion in the child's eyes. The same confusion she'd probably felt many times before, when doors mysteriously closed in her family's face. The teenage son stood tall beside his father, his earlier nervousness replaced with a quiet pride in watching his parents handle the situation with such grace. They told Amanda to take the rest of the day off, not explicitly firing her, but the message was crystal clear. As she gathered her purse from the back office, she could hear Leon Bennett on the phone, his voice carrying through the thin walls as he discussed reviewing our hiring and training procedures. Her hands trembled as she changed out of her work shoes. Walking out onto the sunny Beverly Hills sidewalk felt surreal. The streets she'd strutted down proudly for years, feeling like she belonged among the elite, now seemed to mock her. The designer stores she'd window shopped at during lunch breaks suddenly reminded her of all the people she'd judged, just as she judged their customers. She reached for her phone, but stopped. Who would she call? What would she say? That she'd lost everything because she'd been so busy playing gatekeeper that she'd locked out the people who owned the gate. The worst part was knowing that this wasn't just one mistake. She had spent years quietly turning away people who didn't fit her narrow view of who belonged. She'd always done it carefully, never stating the real reason, always having a plausible excuse ready. But this time, her prejudice had finally caught up with her in the most dramatic way possible. When Paul came out to tell her that Leon Bennett was making more phone calls, probably to corporate HR about her future, Amanda felt physically sick. She sat heavily on a nearby bench, her designer knockoff heels scuffing on the sidewalk. For the first time, she thought about all the people she'd turned away over the years. How many of them had been somebody important? But more importantly, why had she ever thought it was okay to treat anyone as if they weren't important? The sun was setting over Beverly Hills as Amanda finally stood up from the bench. The golden light that usually made everything look magical now felt harsh and exposing. She thought about Monday morning. Would she even have a job to return to? And if she did, would she ever look at people the same way again? As she waited for her rideshare home, Amanda saw her reflection in a store window. She looked exactly the same as she had that morning. But everything else had changed. She had spent so long deciding who belonged and who didn't that she'd never stopped to ask herself if she belonged. Not just in the restaurant, but in a world where people were judged by their character rather than their appearance. The story of Amanda's fall from power spread quickly through Beverly Hills' restaurant community. Some people sympathized with her, revealing their own hidden biases. Others saw it as karma, finally catching up to someone who'd abused her small amount of authority. But for Amanda, it was something else entirely. A harsh but necessary lesson about power, prejudice, and the importance of treating everyone with dignity. The next time she walked past Linden and Company, she saw a new host standing behind her old podium. The host was smiling genuinely at every guest who walked in, regardless of how they looked. And for the first time, Amanda understood that true class had nothing to do with designer clothes or expensive reservations. It was about treating everyone with the respect they deserved, simply for being human. Life has a way of teaching us the lessons we need to learn, often in the most unexpected ways. For Amanda, that lesson came through the very door she had guarded so jealously. Dressed in an expensive suit and carrying a quiet dignity she had been too blind to see. Sometimes the hardest lessons come when we least expect them, and from the people we wrongly judged. But these are often the lessons that change us for the better, if we're willing to learn from them.